Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. When many white people discuss that black people are on average more poor than white people, they like to claim it was because of poor choices and never taking personal responsibility because they always got free handouts. But what if, and let's just be hypothetical here, black people didn't actually get the handouts? White people think they did, but it was actually the white people who got handouts, which is why they're better off. I know it's crazy to entertain this alternative universe where whites are the lazy welfare recipients getting handouts, and the blacks are the hardworking, never getting a hand up to meet their basic needs. How silly. This period was known as the 1950s to the 1970s. No, seriously. The government made welfare for white women only, and white people had no problems with it because it cleared out more white women from the workforce so men could have more jobs. White people, however, still wanted black women to clean their houses and do the domestic jobs they were accustomed to having someone do for them, so they rarely got a dime of welfare, and when they did, they were asked incredibly invasive questions about their sex lives. Their house was given a white glove inspection frequently to determine if they were fit mothers, even though many black women did pretty much nothing but clean because that was their job, cleaning up for white people. If a woman had a man in her life, he literally had to abandon the family if they reached dire straits because the welfare office would do midnight raids, and if they found so much as a man's belt, it was a sign that she was a welfare cheat, and they sued her for welfare fraud. Something literally no white woman had to go through, and even then, the black woman only got around 1/3 of that of white women when she was lucky enough to get welfare in the first place. It wasn't until the Nixon administration and a lot of work from civil rights groups for black women on welfare to be finally given equal access to welfare. And even then, it was only because the Black Panthers were organizing and providing some of the basic needs like medical care and school lunches, and Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover were worried that if kids saw these armed black activists in a positive light for giving them basic necessities the government wouldn't provide, they would get radicalized and become black violent communists. Literally, nothing black people get in this story today are equal to what white people get, and when they do get something, it's actually a trade-off after the government takes something else away, much like the Native American reservations. As the president and the CIA were doing more to crush civil rights groups and the Black Panthers than they were to stop the actual mob. And now we get back to housing. Yes, in the 1950s, white people got one of the biggest handouts since the westward expansion when they got free land to go settle taken from native peoples, which of course most black people got none of it. Freed slaves were supposed to get 40 acres and a mule of rich slaveholders' land taken during the Civil War, but Andrew Johnson, being the petty man that he had always been, resentful of the rich slave owners for looking down on him, as president, so long as they kowtowed to him and kissed his ass, he gave them a presidential pardon with all their land and property back, minus the slaves. With no property of their own and Northern troops getting pulled out of the South after the rigged Hayes election, they had to work as sharecroppers, which in some ways was worse than slavery as they weren't even considered property, so the boss didn't view their lives as valuable at all. Also, with Jim Crow laws and the Black Code, they would literally find any reason to arrest black men on the pettiest offenses and classify it as a felony, so they couldn't vote, and use them as slave labor in prison on chain gangs as the one loophole of the 13th Amendment as prisoners, and then position them in white heavy areas so that their bodies would be counted as higher, giving the area more representation in Congress, but only white people got all the votes. After World War II, when the troops returned home, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Affairs combined together to work to build dirt-cheap, high-quality housing for returning veterans. The government basically made no profit off of it, and the VA gave the vets ridiculously low interest rates. So these vets bought these good houses around $40,000 and are now worth $200,000. This is what the term government housing initially referred to. Their wealth grew ridiculously over the past 70 years compared to what it is now due to changes in the housing market. Which is great, these people fought and served for their nation, and deserved it, except one of the rules is that you could never sell your house later on to a black person. In fact, the black vets didn't get any of this. Black men and women who served and died for this America pretty much got nothing out of the deal. Only 1/5 of blacks even got to go to college on the GI Bill, and only 100 got loans for a house via the VA. The point of this housing system was to create white segregated communities free from the inferior races, especially in the South. This was just a small part of redlining that ensured blacks owed their souls to slumlords or were in debt to a bank for the rest of their lives if they did get a home because the interest rates were so much higher than for a person who was white. This is why it was so hard for black people to leave the ghettos. They owed the bank everything for houses that were now worth nothing, and they just couldn't leave. So after this period, and the vets were housed, the nation stopped building houses for white people. However, they did start building government housing for black people. We call them the projects. Initially, some people were trying to provide actual housing for black people, but other cities realized it could be used as a way to take away land from black people. In many cities, middle-class black communities would suddenly be classified and zoned as a ghetto, and the residents were forced to move out, paying them much less than they were worth. The Hawville area of Indianapolis is one example, but it happened a lot in both North and South around the time. They basically made the government housing as a way to say, look, we gave them an equal trade, now government is providing for them. It's all good, even though their housing was now inferior. On the land, they built the Indiana University Purdue University campus, a place I worked for several years, not knowing about its dark history. Literally, the only time black people got a handout was to have something else taken away or in an attempt to weaken activist groups from recruiting and organizing for a better life. Right now, we have a housing shortage nationwide. 1/3 of most people's incomes is spent on housing. No one on minimum wage can afford rent working 40 hours a week, even though that was the entire point of enacting the minimum wage, so that everyone could afford the basics. Aside from raising the wage, there is also a big root cause that made the shortage of housing way worse. During the recession, when they bailed out banks, but let the people sink or swim, and people were getting kicked out of their homes left and right, there were a ton of empty, rotting houses, so the government weakened its rules and allowed Wall Street firms to buy up real estate and trade them on the open market. This caused the price of housing to shoot up, and in certain areas, there was no financial incentives to make affordable housing, just high-end housing due to higher payouts. So there are now a ton of empty houses that no one can afford. In fact, there are 5 empty houses for roughly every single homeless person. There is a reason why Warren made a promise to decouple the housing market from Wall Street. Not as flashy as free healthcare and education, which wasn't her wheelhouse, but would have significantly reduced costs to individuals. So how do we fix this? Well, my suggestion is that we reinstate the government housing program of the 1950s, but not exclude anyone. We either build new houses or we take abandoned homes and neighborhoods and overhaul and revitalize them so that anyone would enjoy living there. If you or your spouse were a veteran and should have gotten a house, then if racism wasn't so ingrained, you will get first pick and at the price it was back then, not adjusted for inflation. They will be given loans with interest rates lower than market rate to adjust for all the ridiculously inflated interest rates they had to deal with because of active racism. Next, if your parents could have been eligible if not for race, and they either don't take advantage of this new program or are dead, you get the next pick, and at the same cost it was, but then adjusted for half inflation. This is true for siblings of the same parent. If you are a grandchild of an eligible person and they or your parents didn't take advantage, you get a third pick at original price adjusted for inflation. Next, if you're a veteran of any color or a child or grandchild of an eligible person of any color who did not take advantage of this program back in the day, then you get fourth pick at the same cost adjusted for inflation. Your agreement is to not sell it for 10 years, and you're not allowed to sell it to be torn down and replaced. Perhaps we could add low-income professions like teachers and social workers to this list. This would effectively repair this one form of bigotry and discrimination without excluding white people. It would support our veterans and ensure there is enough affordable housing out there. There's also the issue of rent control. When you say rent control in the US, you get sour looks from economists. That's because US-style rent control is stupid. You're locked into the place, and the second you give it up, that good affordable deal is lost to you forever. So the landlord has the least incentive to upgrade or repair your home, often just marking down the days off the calendar till you die, and he can start renting it again for a new market value. He's also more likely to make it unlivable to live there just to try and get you to leave. German-style rent control, on the other hand, locks all rent in the entire city into a 10% range based on the value of the home, and if you find one that goes out of that range, you can challenge it with the city housing authorities, and they can bring the price down. The amount is based carefully on how much it takes to maintain and upkeep a place and the income on the average of the city. You don't make as much as a landlord as you do in the US, but rents are around 400 to 500 euro, or 500 to 625 in some of the biggest, most expensive cities like Berlin. This frees up money they can spend on other things. Thanks to Airbnb, they too are going through a housing crisis and have been cracking down on it to reduce who can use Airbnb. America's housing crisis also spiked because of this. For several years, instead of renting out to people, landlords were using Airbnb because they can make a lot more than rent. Depending on the city now, you can only rent a house out via Airbnb if you personally live in the home and are renting out a spare room. This has also stopped some of the housing crisis issues. I know most of this about Germany from the podcast Radio Spitkauf, a local Berlin radio program in English, though I stopped listening to it once it stopped being just a podcast and they got an official German radio slot because they started becoming more infotainment and less informative. I'm glad they're now fully employed, but it's no longer for me. Anyway, this would effectively repair and give restitution for redlining. I also think anyone who lived through Jim Crow should get remuneration similar to Holocaust survivors, as terrorism was constantly applied to them. And there are many other areas we could give restitution for people who are currently alive who actively suffered from racism. White people are against all forms of restitution for slavery, as neither group are living today. These people are still alive today, both the oppressors and the oppressed, and the impacts are still financially felt to this very day. However, if we were to create restitution programs to all people alive today who got actively screwed over by racism, that might actually successfully bridge the wealth gap between minorities and whites without spending a single thing on reparations for slavery, just because we have actively screwed them over so badly over and over and over and over again, so they were never able to recover from slavery. And it would lower the cost of rent for all by ending the housing crisis, so we wouldn't have to spend a third of our income on rent anymore. Just an idea, and I think it would help out most people in this nation, while bringing justice to the people who suffered the most. So thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm sure there was nothing controversial about this, and everyone will happily get along in the comments section, which you can do on the YouTube version of this video, or my Facebook page, After School Democracy. Link in the show notes. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have over 500 videos on different topics that I've made over the past 10 years. Please subscribe, and if your podcast site has the option, give me a like or review. If you think what I have to say informed you, consider supporting my Patreon. I'll be doing this podcast weekly and try to get it out on the same day, so I hope to see you here next week, ready to be filled with new ideas. Take care. This channel is helped tremendously by the generous supporters on Patreon. A big thank you to the wonderful Joe Taylor, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Ogrel for their support at the $10 a month Wapawet level. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.